Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another book video. I just got home for the holidays and I am pretty jet lagged, but I'm so excited for today's video because we're finally doing my annual reading wrap up, aka ranking all the books that I read this year from worst to best. This is probably my most anticipated video of the year and I know you guys really loved it last year, so yeah, without further ado, let's dive right in. By the way, if you're new here, my name's Kate and I make videos about books, fashion, and my life as a 20-something in Seoul, navigating grad school, and my work as a freelance literary translator. If any of that sounds interesting to you or if you like the books that I'm about to talk about, don't forget to subscribe. And yeah, let's start with sort of the reading stats for the year. Looking back on 2025, I feel like it was a pretty solid reading year. I was able to read 28 books this year and then also 4 extra novels in Korean, so 32 books total, which is pretty solid and I think is where my usual yearly average is at. But more than the number of books, I feel like I just got to read a really wide range of books this year and found a lot of reads I hadn't heard about before. And I would say they were pretty consistently solid, which makes this reading wrap up even more exciting because I do have a lot of books to recommend to you guys. But to get sort of a larger bird's eye view on my reading year, I've been using Fable, who are kindly sponsoring this portion of today's video. No matter what kind of reader you are, Fable really is the all-in-one platform for reading. It allows you to track your reading and curate lists like Goodreads, but also has a social component where you can create posts and host book clubs and read-alongs and just see what other people think about things you're reading as well. I particularly love that they also have like a daily reading tracker that you can tick off just to make sure that you're kind of cultivating that daily habit, especially for the new year. And they've just dropped their 2025 reading wrap, which is kind of like the Spotify wrapped version for books. It shows you a summary of your reading year in like this beautifully curated form that you can also share. So like I mentioned, I read 28 books this year and apparently I was in the top 5% of literary fiction readers on Fable, which is pretty awesome. I also think I'm the only reader on Fable to have listed Journey to the Edge of Life on their list, which is super fun. Apparently it's my rarest read. There's some fun questions. I'm going to keep them secret for the sake of this video, but my favorite cover I think actually is the Journey to the Edge of Life because it was so pretty. And my average rating for the year is 3.9, which like I mentioned, I've had a very solid reading year, really enjoyed the books that I've read. And then obviously the best part is setting next year's reading goals and starting to track them and curate sort of like your TBR lists. And I think I'm going to set my goal at 30 for next year as well. So if you want to learn more about Fable, start tracking your reads and get your own reading wrap for 2025, check out the link in the description. And otherwise, let's start with the flops for the year. So starting with my least favorite read of 2025, I think it's the one book that I DNF'd, which is Prophet Song by Paul Lynch. I was honestly really looking forward to this one because it won the Booker in 2023, I believe, and also there was just a lot of hype about it. A lot of people do really love it, but I was ultimately pretty disappointed. It's a novel about contemporary Ireland, but a dystopian novel where a fascist government slowly starts to take power. And the main character's husband is arrested during a protest and basically disappears or kind of goes missing. And it shows the family trying to deal with the loss of their husband and father and also the changing reality of the society that's becoming much more oppressive. To be totally honest, I think I was just kind of bored and confused by the book. I didn't understand why it needed to be told in this way when this is a reality that has happened throughout history and is currently happening in so many different countries across the world. I think personally I just find it a little disheartening that a book about a theoretical fascist regime in like a white liberal country is much more popular than books that are actually talking about real experiences under those regimes in other countries that are just much more underrepresented. Some of my viewers actually mentioned that like the book was inspired by what's going on in Syria right now, and yeah, it just didn't sit right with me overall. And also the writing style, even though it was very unique, I felt like it was just a little bit more like style for style's sake. I thought it was cool what he was doing with it, but I do think it was kind of difficult to stick with past like the first chapter. So yeah, I ended up putting this book down. I would love to hear your thoughts on it though, because I know it is pretty like controversial. There seems to be a range of opinions. Next, we have The Meursault Investigation by Kamel Daoud. He's an Algerian author, and this is a book sort of inspired by and responding to The Stranger by Albert Camus. Slight spoiler alert, the main character in that novel ends up killing a random Arab man, is basically what he's called, the Arab, I think. And this book, The Meursault Investigation, centers around the brother of that man who was killed and sort of tries to tell his story and the perspective that was not told in The Stranger, criticizing just sort of how blatantly he talked about killing this man like it was no big deal. and then obviously tackling like the lingering imperialism of French colonial rule in Algeria and stuff like that. I chose this book as my November Between Us book club pick, which, by the way, if you're interested in that, the link to join is always down below. But yeah, we were pretty excited about it, and then all of us really did not love the book. The concept, I think, was just so good, and I was really interested in seeing how this author was going to respond to this really iconic work of French literature that unfortunately I think is also the most sort of well-known book to be set in Algeria. It's like not written by an Algerian author though, and I think that is sort of what he was trying to reclaim. However, the writing was just so strange and just kind of like convoluted, and I had no idea what he was trying to say other than a very simple critique of the way Camus approached writing this, which I completely agree with, but I just think it was not enough to sustain the novel for, I think it was like 200 pages or so. So yeah, in my opinion, once you know about the concept, that's kind of all that there is to the book. Wouldn't necessarily recommend. I think I gave it a 2.5 stars. Next is The Perfect Nanny by Leila Slimani. This was a best-selling novel from France about a nanny who ends up killing the children that she is a nanny for. This isn't a spoiler, it's like on the front page. The work deals with questions of class, of obsession, and like possessiveness, and also kind of interrogates just like the position of nannies in our modern world, which I thought was really interesting and very necessary. But unfortunately, even though the premise is so interesting, I felt like the characters were super simple, super flat, and the entire book was very predictable. I just didn't feel very invested in the characters or honestly convinced that they were real. The writing style is really cool. The translation's very well done. It feels kind of like tight, claustrophobic, like obsessive writing, which I really like that it mirrored the tone of the work, but also, yeah, just like the whole plot and everything I didn't think was enough to like make me like it very much. I think I gave it a 2.5 or 3 star. Next is Native Speaker by Chung-Rae Lee. This is a book from the 90s, I believe, about the main character, Henry Park, who works as an undercover agent, basically a spy, and when he's assigned to spy on a Korean American politician, he kind of has a crisis because he is Korean American himself and is trying to decide where his alliances lie. It's really a book about the dilemma of whether or not to assimilate or to support your community, or if it's possible to do both, which I think is a very relevant question for a lot of minority communities in the US and particularly the Asian American community, so I really appreciated that. However, I just feel like the writing style wasn't particularly my favorite. It was written in first person. I didn't really like the main character, which I think kind of dampened the whole experience. And I also just felt like the questions were a little bit more simple and kind of dated ideas about race and identity, particularly Asian American identity. It just felt almost like cliche or like very simple, which I think might just be because we're 30 years past that and we're looking back at a different era. But I do think more modern works present Asian American identity in a much more interesting, sort of complex way. At the same time, I'm super grateful to Chung-Rae Lee and for what he did. He kind of, opened the door to Korean American literature in the US. So I think he really deserves the respect. But yeah, I didn't love the book myself. The last flop is a little bit confusing. It's Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck. This won the International Booker in 2024, I believe, and it's a book set in East Berlin during the time when East Germany was kind of crumbling and the whole regime was sort of falling apart. But that political setting kind of acts as a backdrop to the central love story of the book, which is between a man in his 50s and a girl who I think is like 19 at the start of their affair. And the age gap is just so freaking uncomfortable. And I think that was the main reason I just couldn't get behind the book. I do understand that it's a metaphor, and I feel like I don't really know that much about East Germany, to be fair. And I think the writer was trying to do something really interesting in talking about sort of like the generational differences and using the man as like a metaphor for the oppressiveness and kind of like the datedness and traditionalness, I guess, of East Germany. But at the same time, just reading in such detail about their love was not my favorite. Just know that going into this book. I do feel like there are not that many books written about East Germany, so I think it could be worth reading if you're interested. The writing is very beautiful, and the translation was absolutely just like genius, and I think that's probably why it won the Booker. But just know that huge trigger warning, and for me, I don't know if it was personally worth it. Moving on to the Fell Shorts, these are books that I enjoyed and I think are worth reading but wouldn't necessarily rush to recommend them. And first on the list is Witness by Jamel Brinkley. This is Brinkley's second short story collection after A Lucky Man, which I absolutely loved and remains one of my favorite short story collections to this day. Both are short story collections telling the stories of Black characters and families in New York, but Witness deals a little bit more with a gentrifying New York, so like a changing sort of demographic and experience in particularly Brooklyn and the Bronx, while also keeping Brinkley's interest in telling stories about generational gaps, complex families and romantic love and things like that as well. He really is just such a stunning writer, and I think that's what kept me reading throughout the book. There are just certain descriptions that really just blow my mind. And my favorite part about his work is that you can really feel the love he has for his characters and the world, which I've talked about this before, but that's kind of like my baseline for a good writer, is just a writer who really loves the world that they're trying to show us. But the reason Witness didn't impress me as much as A Lucky Man did is because there was really a wide range in the stories. Like some of them were really, really incredible, and then others I was kind of like, why is this here? Like, why was this written? And I think in general, the collection didn't stick with me as much as his first collection, so definitely check out A Lucky Man if you get the chance. The next is The White Album by Joan Didion, which is a collection of essays written in 1979, looking back on sort of like the counterculture movements of the 60s and general mass culture at the time, as well as Joan Didion's sort of personal experiences and her travels throughout the US as well. I think Joan Didion is an icon for a reason. Her writing has such a strong mood, and she's just so sharp in her observations about sort of like social movements and societal change. But I just think her writing style is a little bit more detached than what I enjoy reading, and I think it's a kind of like nonfiction essay that I personally don't find interesting enough to like keep me captivated for a whole book. Next after that is Between the Acts by Virginia Woolf. For the past couple of years, I've kind of been unofficially doing this thing that I think I'm going to try to actually do for the rest of my reading life, hopefully, which is to read a book from one of my favorite authors each year. So for now, that's a Baldwin book, a Woolf book, and a Morrison book each year. And this year, I did not read anything by Toni Morrison, but I did read something by Baldwin and Virginia Woolf. She's one of my favorite writers of all time, but I do think this is probably my least favorite of her works that I've read. It was her final novel, and it kind of follows like this English town as the town puts on a play, a pageant about like the history of England. And it kind of also in classic Woolf fashion goes through like the stream of consciousness, like jumps around from character to character and sort of like their anxieties about their personal lives and their town, but also about where England is going, especially in the face of the Second World War, I believe. So I think it's a really cool concept. Maybe it would hit harder if you were actually from England, but this is a history I am not very familiar with. And I also think the writing was just a little bit harder to follow in this one and a little bit more boring in terms of plot than her other works. But I'm still glad I got to include Woolf in my list this year. Next is another book club pick. We read Heartlamp by Banu Mushtaq, which was also the International Booker Prize winner for this year. This is a short story collection about the lives of various women and girls in Muslim communities in southern India. It follows a large cast of characters in sort of like this very intricate world, sort of dealing with their everyday tragedies and injustices. But she manages to find a lot of humor in these situations, and the dialogue and just like the community and the world itself felt so rich and alive, which I really loved. I think it's absolutely worth reading, but I do think the stories feel pretty repetitive by the end. Like the sort of message that they're trying to send is pretty similar. So I'm really glad I got to read it. I do definitely think it's worth checking out, but yeah, just keep that in mind. It might get a little bit old towards the end. Next, I have Journey to the Edge of Life by Tezer Oslu, and like I mentioned, this I think is the prettiest cover of any book I've read this year. I found this at Green Apple Books in San Francisco when I was there on a trip in April, and it had just been published. And yeah, it's so fun when you actually discover a book in a bookstore and it's not off like some recommendation or something online. I just really love that feeling. So I'm glad this book found its way to me. But basically, Tezer Oslu is a very famous writer in Turkey, and this is one of her autofiction works. I think it was published in the 80s. It follows a writer, basically her, as she visits the gravesites of her favorite writers across Europe and sort of talks about life and art and how to deal with life through art. Definitely a trigger warning for suicide because it's a big theme throughout the novel, but the way she talks about writing and literature and her love for art was just really fun to read. I will say, though, the writing was super confusing at the same time. It's a non-linear narrative and kind of stream of consciousness. You have no idea where or when in the timeline you are throughout the book, and I think after a while I kind of just went along with it, but I do think it was a little bit more confusing and didn't stick with me as long as my other reads from this year. Next, I finally have a physical copy of this. It's Everything That Rises Must Converge by Flannery O'Connor. This is another short story collection from a very iconic, sort of classic American writer. It was my first time reading Flannery O'Connor, and I'm so glad I did. I feel like she's a pretty underrated writer in the US in general. She has these very sharp short stories that feel almost like O. Henry or like Hemingway, but they deal with class, gender, race in the American South and kind of look at it with like a moralistic lens. I think she definitely has like a Christian Catholic background as well, so a lot of that comes in, which I didn't really catch but was very interesting to read. Her writing really is like a masterclass in craft and asking really big philosophical questions and like making you really think in the space of a short story. I do think that her stories that dealt with race, though, were pretty uncomfortable to read or just difficult, and yeah, there's a really interesting New Yorker article that I'll link down below about her and sort of her racist. I personally think that we should still read problematic writers and talk about their problematic beliefs, but yeah, just keep that in mind as you approach it. I do think that made it a little bit difficult. Lastly, in this category, I have Cautery by Lucia Littmeyer. This is a novel by an Argentinian author, I believe, and it follows the lives of two women, one in contemporary Barcelona and then a English woman living in colonial Massachusetts in the 1600s. Two very random stories, but both so interesting to read. And it's done in interchanging chapters, so one is set in Barcelona, then the other in colonial Massachusetts, so on and so forth. And yeah, the two stories never really connect. Like, it's not like a time travel story or anything, which I really appreciated. I thought the structure and just the idea was super cool, and the actual voices of the characters are so fun throughout, like just so entertaining to read. And yeah, the first like half or so really flew by. Both the stories are dealing with sort of like the restrictions and heartbreak of being a woman but 400 years apart, and it's sort of discussing how to find freedom within that, or if it's even possible. I thought these questions were so cool, but they were not really answered for me by the end. I just felt like the ending of this book felt very rushed and kind of random, and I was left kind of unsatisfied, even though the writing style at the beginning really had me hooked. So kind of they had us in the first half read. Okay, it's the next day now. I actually had to stop filming because I was so tired because of jet lag, but we are back in the same outfit for continuity's sake, and I'm going to get into the books that I really solidly enjoyed this year, books that I would recommend to basically anybody. Starting off with The Door by Magda Szabó. This is a Hungarian classic about the relationship between a woman who's sort of like an intellectual scholar and then her housekeeper named Emerence, who's like an older woman who she first depends on just to like kind of take care of her home, clean it and everything, and then increasingly the main character becomes more emotionally dependent on her, and their relationship turns into like kind of this strange, codependent, slightly obsessive one. The book sort of shows the strange power dynamic between these two women with like their different classes, their different ages, and then different sort of capabilities. And in general, I think that the character of Emerence just really sort of carries the book. She's such a strange but like unforgettable character, and yeah, I feel like you keep reading because you just want to see what she's doing and what their relationship is going to look like. The writing is also kind of super intense and moody and also really entertaining to read. I just thought that what the writer was trying to do with these two characters in terms of societal commentary was pretty simple and like straightforward. When this book was recommended to me, some people compared it to Pinheiro, Claudia Pinheiro, and Elena Knows. I do think that I prefer Pinheiro's books and Elena Knows in particular, and whatever. She just does a really good job of connecting the personal to the political in like a really sort of complex, interesting way, whereas this one I think was just more for the characters' relationships. Next is Madonna in a Fur Coat by Sabahattin Ali. This is another book club pick, and it follows the love story between a Turkish man, Raif, and a woman, Maria, in Berlin in the 1920s. It's set in the 20s, and I think it was written in the 40s, but it feels like such a modern love story, which is what I really enjoyed about it. It talks about the line between love and obsession, between like a fantasy of someone and then the reality of that actual person, and whether you can, actually really love someone, or do you really love the idea of someone. And then it also kind of offers a critique of of like just being passive in both our love lives and just our general lives, which I really enjoyed. And yeah, I think the writing's really fun. Next we have Simple Passion by Annie Ernaux. I read 3 books by Ernaux this year, and yeah, this is the first one on the list. I read this in one day. It's a really short book. I think it's like 50 pages, about a love affair that Ernaux had with a married man. And even though that is definitely morally a little bit complex, it's kind of like a very honest and tense look into sort of her emotions at the time and how all-consuming and kind of obsessive her desire was for this man, and also just like what it felt like to be in sort of like this whirlwind of a relationship. I feel like this is a topic that shows up in a lot of different books, but just the way that she tries to really objectively portray what she was feeling, even if it was really illogical or almost like morally questionable, and doesn't necessarily try to like defend or justify her decisions. I think that's like such a cool way to write, and that's what I really love about Ernaux, is that she tries to be so objective about things that other people really generally can't be objective about. I also just absolutely love the translation of her writing, and yeah, I wrote down a couple quotes from this book, and I'll just read one really quickly. It says, "Sometimes I wonder if the purpose of my writing is to find out whether other people have done or felt the same things, or if not, for them to consider experiencing such things as normal. Maybe I would also like them to live out these very emotions in turn, forgetting that they had once read about them somewhere." So yeah, so many stunning lines and just like cool revelations kind of crammed into a tiny book. So I would absolutely recommend that one. Next, we have Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I guess this is sort of like the one classic I read this year. And yeah, this is the love story between 2 characters, Catherine and Heathcliff, who grow up in the same family, but Heathcliff is adopted into the family. And due to reasons of class and sort of like these restrictive societal expectations and rules, the 2 are in love but can't ultimately marry. And essentially the book goes into like why that was, shows the effects of that on their children's lives, and then kind of really shows, I think, the psychological impact of these societal restrictions and kind of being told you don't deserve certain things and things like that through the character of Heathcliff, who was always kind of shunned from this world because of his class background, because of his race and color and all sorts of things. So it really was just so ahead of its time, and yeah, such a moody book, such an atmospheric read. And I do think obviously it's a classic, so it's a little bit slow, but once you kind of get into it and get used to it, it goes by really fast. And yeah, it's just such an entertaining classic. So I'd really recommend for next year, especially before the movie comes out, even though I don't know if I'm going to watch it. Next, I have Wandering Stars by Tommy Orange. This is Tommy Orange's second novel. I really enjoyed They're There, which is his first. And yeah, this really just convinced me that he really is like one of the best American writers of our time. Follows a Native American family from like the late 1800s, I believe, in sort of like these boarding schools that forced assimilation onto Native American students. And then the following chapters in the first half of the book are told by each like sort of subsequent generation. So it goes from like the 1900s through like the current day, and it kind of shows the effects of these families' experiences and their trauma, like really the generational trauma that gets carried on, but then also the love that gets carried on as well. The second half of the book, though, follows one family in contemporary America who are the descendants of this family, and specifically looks into their struggles with addiction and also kind of grappling with their Native American identity. And yeah, the second half is so enjoyable. I think the first half works conceptually, but I feel like the characters in the second half are really what sold me on this book. His writing is so beautiful and really makes them come to life. They just feel like such real people. And yeah, by the end of this book, I was just so invested in their lives and their relationships, and yeah, it kind of made me tear up and all that good stuff. So yeah, definitely recommend Tommy Orange. I just am really excited to see what he does next. Then we have I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. I saw this book absolutely everywhere, and I'm really glad I got to it this year. It's a pretty short speculative fiction novel, originally written in French, about a group of women who live in like a bunker underground and aren't really sure why. And yeah, there's no men in this bunker, and so this main character, who is sort of like the youngest out of these women, really has like basically never seen a man. But even though that's the title of the book, that's actually not what it explores at all. It's more about how these women kind of come to understand how they ended up in the situation and also learn to lean on each other for survival. Yeah, I don't want to spoil too much, but it's just like such a unique, strange story. Like, I'm so curious how this author came up with this idea and the mood of it, the things it explores about what really matters in life. Like, do we really need to know why we exist or how things came to be? I just felt like those questions were really interesting. And yeah, I think when I read it, I just thought it was very beautifully written, really interesting, but it's actually surprisingly stuck with me for a while. Like, I just remember the mood and sort of like the idea of it so well. So I think that's proof that it really is worth the hype, worth a read. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it if anyone's read it down below. And lastly, in this category, we have the short story collection Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung. This is a collection of sort of speculative, almost like literary horror short stories. Some of them are more horror, some of them are more like kind of fantasy or sci-fi. Bora Chung is just unlike any writer I've ever read. Her stories are so imaginative, and they are both like very modern, but also kind of folk-tale-y, and I love the way she has these like really imaginative twists on reality to sort of critique just the way society works today. I will say sometimes the stories can get a bit difficult to read, or just like a little bit more horror-esque, a little bit more gory, but I do think even for me as a complete horror beginner, it wasn't too bad. And so I'd really recommend, if you enjoy books that kind of make you react, that, you know, really like pull you in and make you think. Okay, and now for the 9 best books of the year, aka the books I can confidently say really blew my mind this year and sort of made my reading year. I love all of these reads. I'd love to talk about them with you in the comments, and also just, yeah, really recommend them so strongly going into 2026. The first is Just Above My Head by James Baldwin. Like I mentioned, this was my one Baldwin read of the year, and I absolutely loved it. It's about 2 brothers growing up in Harlem in the 50s and 60s, and the younger brother, becomes a really famous sort of gospel singer. And then the book is told from the older brother's perspective, looking back on their lives and their relationship. What can I say? It's James Baldwin. The characters and the dialogue are just incredible. And even though the book goes from Harlem to like the American South to then Paris and stuff, like each setting just feels so real and so alive. And even though I will say the beginning was a little bit slow, once I stuck with it, I just got super invested in the characters and their relationships. As usual, in between the plot and sort of like the development of these characters, there are just like the most beautiful reflections on like being human, being alive, on race and injustice in America, and then also, you know, on like the impact of music and art and literature. He is just such a beautiful writer, and I will read his grocery list. Like, I just think the way he thinks about the world is so fascinating and really enriches my view of the world. So if you haven't had the chance to read Baldwin yet, please do. I think any of his shorter works, his more famous works, are a great place to start, but also, yeah, if you are kind of a fan, Just Above My Head was absolutely worth it. Next, we have Perfection by Vincenzo Latronico. I'm kind of surprised that this ended up so high on my list, because it's really a book with very little plot and very little character, which are usually the things I really enjoy. But it's kind of like an almost anthropological satire about a young expat couple, a millennial couple living in Berlin, who really are just trying to live like the most aesthetically and also morally perfect lives, and are very tuned into like hipster culture, kind of millennial culture, and like social media as well. It's basically critiquing this like endless search for a perfect life and for a perfectly sort of packageable life that seems to be a big thing amongst millennials and Gen Z. And yeah, it just made me reevaluate my whole life. I think it should be required reading for anyone of our generation. And what I really like about it is that it's not so cynical that it feels like the author is looking down on people who act like the couple in the book, but more so asking like, what is the point of doing all this? Like, what are we really striving for, and is it meaningful? And I feel like that enough was just so mind-blowing. It's a really short book, but definitely something that will make you think for a while, so I'd really recommend it. Next, we have Minor Detail by Adania Shibli. This is a Palestinian novel that's written in 2 parts. The first is set in the 1948 First Nakba, and then the second is set in Palestine in 2017, which is when the book was published. And without any spoilers, the first part is told from the perspective of an Israeli soldier who is involved in like this crime, and then the second part follows a Palestinian journalist in 2017 who kind of becomes obsessed with this case and wants to know more and seeks more details. This is also a book that I have rightfully seen everywhere in the past couple of years, and I do think it really deserves all the hype. It delves a little bit into the history of the occupation, but also more so shows how it has affected the minor details of everyday lives of people in Palestine. What is happening in Palestine and what has happened in Palestine is so horrible and devastating on like a major and minor scale, but this book really focuses on how the minor details are really what create like a culture, a place, a people, and how it's in the destruction of those minor details of life that you destroy a people and a country. And yeah, I just thought it was so delicately done, but also really powerful. Obviously a pretty heavy read, but if you haven't read it yet, I would definitely recommend for next year. Then I have Reservoir Bitches by Dalia de la Cerda. This is a short story collection from contemporary Mexico. It features 13 short stories about various women and girls kind of dealing with their everyday lives. And it's a lot of different types of women, which I really appreciated. There's stories about sisterhood, about friendship, about transness, and it deals with violence against women, but in a way that's very human and kind of shows like the impacts on the everyday lives of these characters, which I really liked. Even though that's obviously kind of like a complex, heavy subject, the actual voices of these characters are so funny and witty and just like strong, and yeah, I honestly unforgettable. The characters are so imperfect and kind of flawed, but I think that's what makes the book feel really real. And my favorite books are the ones that are both entertaining but also impactful and important to read, and I really think this ticks all those boxes. I will say I have a member in my book club who's actually from Mexico, and she said that she and her friends didn't love the book when she read it in the original Spanish, so I wonder if there's something in the translation that was just really beautifully done. I'm not really sure. Please let me know what you think if you've read it in either the Spanish or the English, but yeah, I really enjoyed the translation. Next, I have Chilean Poet by Alejandro Zambra. This is a novel about the relationship between a stepfather and a stepson and sort of the love they have for each other, their bond, even though there's no sort of formal relationship between them because the stepfather isn't actually married to the stepson's mother, he's just her boyfriend, but it shows how their kind of care for each other really defies any kind of like definition. The stepfather is a poet and the stepson grows up to be a poet, so poetry is also really at the center of the book, and it kind of talks about what it means to be a poet in Chile, where poetry is so important to the culture and the history of the country. I just really loved the writing and the characters in this book. It's very heartwarming and kind of emotional, but also not too like sentimental. Like it's not too mushy for no reason. The writing is really sarcastic and funny, but it kind of pairs with this really beautiful relationship, and I think unexpectedly it's really lasted with me. So yeah, I definitely recommend it for next year. Then we have a really recent read, actually, which is Stillborn by Guadalupe Nettel. This is another novel from contemporary Mexico that centers around two friends, one who has decided to remain childless, and then one who decides she wants to have a child, but then has a lot of complications with the birth. And the book kind of goes into all the shame and pressures and expectations that come with being a mother, but then also choosing to not be a mother, and really unpacks like all the complex taboo feelings behind being a mother, like even the really negative ones as well. And yeah, I'm just really grateful this book exists because it kind of shows how much of a fantasy and like a kind of false expectation exists around being a mother, while also at the same time kind of showing how beautiful and complex all caretaking is. Not just motherhood, but all kinds of care through being a friend or a neighbor or whatever. And yeah, an added plus is that it's written in vignettes, so it's very readable and goes by super fast. Next, we have my second Erno book of the year, which is A Man's Place. This is kind of like a memoir, nonfiction reflection on her father and his sort of place as a working class man in rural France. And the book kind of goes into the differences between his and her experiences, especially as she was able to be educated and enter like this bourgeoisie class, becoming like an intellectual scholar. Throughout the book, she's trying to look at her father, again, objectively as like a man of his time and investigate sort of like what his experience was like, what was important to him. But I think in trying to be objective, so much of her love and respect for him comes out in her writing, and I just love experiencing that as a reader, which is why I think Erno has quickly become one of my favorite writers this year. In an earlier video talking about this book, I mentioned like reading her work is kind of like watching the scenes in movies where the character is trying not to cry and that actually makes you a lot more emotional. I think Erno is exactly that. Like she's trying not to be emotional, and that makes the book so much more impactful. I think she also has a book written about her mom that I want to read next year, and yeah, would absolutely recommend this one. Okay, now on to my second favorite book of the year. This is so exciting. Such an unexpected gem. I have The Girls by John Bowen. I actually stumbled upon this book earlier this year at my favorite bookstore in my hometown, Alien and Majesty in Austin. And it's published by McNally Jackson. I think basically what they do is they publish books that they think are like gems and kind of like underrated, but that kind of went out of print because they're older books. And so I think this one was written in the 80s, but it is so, so good. It's about a couple, Sue and Janet, who live in the English countryside and run like a cute little store. And they live this very idyllic, happy life, but then they kind of unintentionally get involved in a murder. And I'm going to leave it there just because I really don't want to spoil what happens. It's both very suspenseful, like keeps you on your toes, but also like the coziest read ever. The main characters are so relatable and you find yourself like rooting for them through all kinds of crazy situations. And yeah, the writing is beautiful and the descriptions are really well done. And the book is also perfectly paced. It's just sometimes a book isn't necessarily about anything or trying to really say anything, but is so perfect and like so charming that it really reminds you of like the joy of reading when you were a kid. And this is exactly that book. I've been recommending it to basically everyone since, and my boyfriend read it. He absolutely loved it. Yeah, I'm just so grateful I found it, and I definitely want to read more by this author as well. And now, the much-awaited best book of 2025. I actually have it in physical form, which we all know is very rare. This is The Years by Annie Ernaux. Like I mentioned, it's been a big Ernaux year for me, and actually this is the book that started it all. I think I read this book in like January or February, and it has stuck with me throughout the entire year, which is how you know it's a real winner. And after reading this, I was like, I need to read basically everything she's ever written, so I'm trying to do that in the next couple of years. This is, I think, her longest and sort of like longest spanning work. It's a memoir that covers 60 years in her life and in French history, I think from the 40s to the 2000s. There's actually like no I that exists, so it's not really a memoir. It's almost like this long extended essay or like study of the time and of herself. She refers to herself in the third person in the book, but then she also uses a lot of we to kind of show the general sort of like zeitgeist or like thoughts at the time, the culture at the time, and she jumps between these two so effortlessly, kind of showing how in some ways our personal lives feel like they're not really that related to what's going on in the world around us. But looking back, the two are so intertwined, and the changing currents of the time impact us personally, and a generation's personal experiences also then impact what they want to change about the world. I just think it's some of the best writing and definitely some of the best translation I've ever read. She really just is such a master at like zooming into these tiny details that really make a time and a place come alive, but then at the same time also delivering like these very grand observations, like large scale observations about society. Honestly, I have no idea how she packs it all in because it's not that long. It's like slightly over 200 pages, I think, but it's a book I hope to keep revisiting throughout my life, especially as I age and kind of like enter all the different ages she is throughout the book as well. And it's so funny because actually she talks about in the book being young and wanting to write this book essentially and not being able to when she was a lot younger. I think just reading that, it made me think, honestly, if I could write anything that comes close to this in my lifetime, I can die happy. Like, it just is such an extraordinary read, and absolutely recommend it. Made my year and allowed me to discover a really great author, and I'm definitely excited to read more of her work next year. Okay, that took forever, but we finally made it to the end of 2025 and the end of this video. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching, and please feel free to subscribe if you haven't yet. Please let me know if you've read any of these books this year or any other year and what you think about them, as well as your best books of the year. I really love your recommendations, and truly they have added so many good books into my life as well. Don't forget to check out my link for Fable and their reading wrap up in the link in my description box. And if you have been reading along with me this year, thank you so much. I'm so excited to see y'all in the new year and see what we get up to, what we read, what the year has in store. I think it's going to be good. And with that, Happy New Year. I'll see you in 2026. Bye.